it's Aaron. Yes, I'm standing in front of a German flag. No, I'm not going to talk about why, because today I have something far more important to talk about, and that's Donald Trump and his recent tweet where he said that he thinks it's a good idea that the Federal Reserve reduces the interest rates to 0 or less than 0%. Now, a lot of people out there are probably hearing that news and thinking, what does this mean? And I think that is not a bug. It's a feature. I think that most people aren't aware of how the economic system actually functions intentionally, because the more people understand the economy, the more you realize that all of this is just a great big casino meant to allow rich people, bankers, politicians, billionaires, to make disgusting, obscene amounts of money. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why. So, like I was saying, most of us don't really understand how the banking system works, how the economic system works, and we certainly, or at least most of us, don't understand why reducing interest rates would be a bad thing. And to explain why, I have to go through a little bit of detail, a little bit of history, and talk about, well, the first economic recession. So, when you have interest rates, they are basically there to stem rampant inflation. Now, interest rates, for those of you who don't know, are basically if you borrow a certain amount of money, you have to pay a certain amount of interest on top of that money so you can actually have access to that money. It's a great deal for the banks. They basically give you $50 or $500 and they say to you, here, you can have this $50 or $500, but in return, we want you to give us 15, 20, 30% interest. So that means you have to pay them back a little bit more money than the amount that you initially pulled out, because that's the way banking functions. It's a great deal for banks because they get to loan you money and they get more money back from it. But the interesting thing about that is that every time the bank loans you money, it's actually just creating that money out of thin air. Every bank has the ability to do this. They basically take your bank account and they take the balance and they say, okay, you had $4,000. Well, now we're going to give you $400,000, and that $400,000 minus that $400 that you had initially is going to be the loan that we give you that you pay interest on. And they simply do that with the strokes of a couple of keys on a keyboard. Very simple, and all of a sudden your bank balance goes from X amount of money to several times more than that, $400,000 or whatever it was that I said. Initially, when the dollar was based on the gold standard, such a thing wasn't necessarily possible. You couldn't just print money, or at least if you did, it would create all kinds of problems. Basically, if you think about it, under the gold standard, you have a set amount of gold that reflects the amount of money that's in the system. If you have $50 worth of gold, there's $50 within the system that you can spend. Once that $50 is gone, that gold is gone. It basically works that way. If you were to print more dollar bills than the gold actually was worth, then those dollar bills aren't worth as much as the gold anymore. Their price goes down. So you start to see the price of that dollar drop. That means that the amount of goods that dollar has the purchasing power to buy is far less. If you could buy 10 hamburgers for $10 before, now you're only going to be able to buy 5 hamburgers for that same $10. That's basically how this works. So they create interest to stem that inflation. That's what you call that. That's called inflation. And interest is basically a way for them to take that extra money that was created, however it was created, back out of the system so it doesn't create that rampant inflation. Makes pretty good sense so far. Now, the problem with that, though, is that the Federal Reserve and other banks work very diligently to be able to make sure that they can produce as much debt as they want without ever having to worry about any sort of inflation. And the way that this works is through, well, basically Reaganomics. If you give all of the money, not to the people, but to the top 1%, then they hoard that money and it never trickles down to the rest of the people. That's the idea through Reaganomics, is that if you give all the money to the people at the top, it'll trickle down to the rest of the people and they will all become wealthy. But that doesn't actually happen. What actually happens is that money becomes hoarded at the top and doesn't move anywhere. So then that would that would give you the assumption that, well, if there's more money being printed, then that means that inflation should be happening and goods should cost more. And they do to a certain extent, but they don't cost so much more that it's unreasonable. You don't see outrageous inflation happening all of the time, even though we see outrageous amounts of money being pooled at the top 1%. And this is because businesses aren't able to sell their goods at any higher price than they're already selling them. If they sell a cheeseburger for $1 and they want to, and all of a sudden there's a rampant inflation and they need to sell that cheeseburger for $2, they're not going to be able to do that because the population is already over leveraged. Like I said before, everybody is under massive amounts of debt right now. Personal debt, corporate debt, business debt, and even economic debt is through the roof, or governmental debt, sorry, is through the roof. It's at higher levels than it's ever been. So the idea that the consumer can just spend more money is outrageous. So raising prices on things like hamburgers is impossible because it's already at its peak price. That puts the businesses in a position where instead of getting the money from the consumer, they end up having to get that money through debt. They take out loans, they take out debt so they can actually basically cover their cost. And the consumer is put in the exact same situation. Their wages haven't gone up since the 70s, but they still need to buy things. They're encouraged to buy all sorts of things. Houses, cars, cups, dishes, chairs, jackets, clothing, whatever you can think of. People are incentivized to buy those things. And even if they don't have the money, they still have to buy them. Education is a great example, actually. Even if you don't have the money for an education, you still have to get one, or else you're not going to be able to get a job to pay off that education that you had to pull out a bunch of money and basically put yourself in debt for. That's how this all works. So the people are leveraged, they're in debt. The banks are, the corporations are leveraged, they're in debt. So what happens? Well, the bank just prints a bunch of money and it gives that money to the people for them to go ahead and willy-nilly spend. But that means that those banks, the Federal Reserve, is also creating a massive amount of debt. The person that ends up at the very end of that debt debt lineup, at that debt queue, is the government. The government always ends up paying the debts at the very end. And since the government doesn't have any money to pay those debts, it's printing cash as well. So since it's printing so much cash, people are pulling out more and more loans. And they're pulling out those loans at a certain interest rate. But that interest rate is supposed to increase to reduce the influx of money that's within the system. But if it does that, then all of a sudden, all of the businesses, all of the corporations, everybody looks at the interest rate going up and they think, holy shit, I've already over-leveraged every asset that I have. I already am in so much debt that if I have that interest rate go up, say I'm paying 5% interest rate and it goes to 10%, that means that we're going to go out of business. That means that the entire economy is going to crash, even though not bringing that interest rate up will inevitably lead to the economic collapse anyway, because it's bringing the system to a point of where it's overinflated, where it's creating more and more cash without actually increasing the amount of money, or without actually increasing the amount of goods that money can buy. So you have this rampant runaway inflation. And there's no way to stem that problem unless you do something like reduce the interest rate. If you increase the interest rate, all of the businesses go bust and the economy crashes because they can't pay back their loans. So the obvious thing is to reduce the interest rate. Bring it down to zero so people can borrow money easier. Or bring it to less than zero, so then people are actually paid to borrow money. Yeah, that's right. They'll pay you a certain amount of money for you to be able to borrow more money. Crazy, wild idea, isn't it? But it seems like that might stimulate the economy, doesn't it? And it does. For a short amount of time, stimulating the economy in this way definitely does work. It allows people to leverage themselves even further and take out even more debt without actually solving the initial problem. Like I've said in many videos, this problem has been perpetuated ever since 2008. The majority of people that are out there watching this video right now have not seen any sort of recovery from the economic crash. They're still just treading water. But the big banks and the businesses are playing Monopoly with this money. They're playing it all in this giant system, this giant casino system, and they're just making outrageous amounts of money out of it. And as soon as they see the system start to falter, as though it's going to crash, they just cash out and they leave. So reducing the interest rates from whatever they are now, very low, to 0 or next to 0 or less than 0, means that in the short amount of time, all of these businesses, all of these corporations, all of these wealthy people are going to be able to borrow more money for very little or no interest at all, and inflate the system even more, creating an even bigger bubble that will eventually explode spectacularly, taking all of us down with it. That's basically where we're headed. And if Donald Trump is able to lobby the Federal Reserve, like he's been able to several times in the past, to lower those interest rates, then that's what we're going to see. Now, Donald Trump isn't a stupid man. I mean, he is a stupid man, but also on top of that, he's also very clever. And he understands this whole system. In fact, I think it was 4 months ago, he made this exact same comment, or it might have actually been longer than that. It might have been when he was still running for president. He made the exact same comment that lowering interest rates basically just shows that this is a fictitious system. The system doesn't even work properly. It's not even real. And in that assessment, he's not necessarily wrong. Then why would it be that several months or possibly years, if my time scale is all off here, why would it be that a while after that, he would decide that lowering interest rates would be a good idea? Well, it's because he's trying to stop the economy from crashing before the election. If he's able to stop the economy from falling through the fucking floor before the election actually happens, then he's going to be sitting pretty. But if he doesn't do that before the election happens, then he's going to be blamed for that. So what he's looking for is a short-term solution, something that's going to fix the problem right now, even though it's just going to create a bigger problem in the future, and that's lowering interest rates. Once these interest rates are at its lowest point, or even negative, then people are going to be buying again, people are going to be borrowing again, people are going to be spending again, and the economy is going to seem as though it's okay. It's going to seem as though everything is doing fine, when in fact, it's just like another shot of adrenaline in the arm of the economy. It's not going to help anything, and in fact, it's just going to exacerbate these problems to the point of which, when we actually do crash, the crash will be harder than we have ever seen, possibly in the history of the world. Banks are leveraged. Corporations are leveraged. People are leveraged to a higher point now than has been seen throughout all of history. And somehow Donald Trump thinks that leveraging people more will save the economy. The truth is that he doesn't care if it saves the economy. The truth is that he cares that it saves his reputation. And if it happens if it happens after the election, the economy crashing that is, then he's going to be fine. He has 4 more years to figure out how he's going to deal with it. But if it happens before that, well, that could mean that he wouldn't win. And for Donald Trump, that's the biggest problem that could ever happen. Anyway, that's my show. My name is Aaron. Thank you very much for watching. If you do get a chance, please check me out on Patreon. Every dollar does help fund this show. And have a nice day.